I've been at KERA News for about 2 years, and most of my coverage has focused on environmental justice and environmental journalism. And that is something that now I'm trying to continue with my new beat, that is Dallas City Hall. And I'm here joined today by a group of amazing environmental justice leaders here in Dallas. And I feel really honored to be here because I have talked to almost every single one of them for one of the stories that I've reported on when it comes to the environment here. And I'm gonna go ahead and introduce them. Over here in the green is Victoria Ferrer Ortiz. She was born in Dallas, Texas. She lived in West Dallas until the age of 5 and then moved to Oak Cliff. Victoria's mother was an educator within DISD and impressed upon her the importance of being a lifelong learner at a young age. She attended the Judge Barefoot Sanders Law Magnet School at Ewell Townview Magnet Center. In 2016, she received her Bachelor's of Arts in Investigative Studies from the University of North Texas in Denton, and with concentrations in International Studies, Sociology, and Public Administration and Community Service. She minored in Social Sciences and received her certificate in Mexican American and Latinx Studies. Victoria is a barrio historian of the Cemento Grande barrio of West Dallas and Oak Cliff. She served as an at-large commissioner on the Arts and Culture Advisory Commission for the City of Dallas. And Victoria co-founded RAYO Planning, an urban planning nonprofit that centers people's lived experiences, and was recently identified as one of the 6 to watch on the social justice front by the Dallas Morning News. Welcome, Victoria. Thank you. Next to her is Jennifer Rangel. She is the co-founder and co-chair of RAYO Planning, a nonprofit that advocates for fair and affordable housing, free of environmental hazards via community education, direct advocacy, community planning, and reforming city planning. She received her master's degree in city and regional planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her BS in recreation, park, and tourism sciences with a minor in urban planning and sociology. Jennifer grew up in West Oak Cliff and was shaped by both the inequities she observed in Dallas and her family's economic hardships. Jennifer still lives in Oak Cliff and continues to be of service to her community that helped her be where she is today. Next to me over here is Albert Mata. He is a board member of Somos Tejas. Somos Tejas is a civic engagement group based in Dallas. Most of Albert's focus over the last year has been in supporting neighborhood associations in Oak Cliff, increasing participation from their neighbors. He also worked to increase awareness and engagement in West Oak Cliff's area plan process. Albert grew up in Oak Cliff, Texas, where he continues to reside. And lastly, we have Desiree D. Powell, is an Arlington, Texas native, where she graduated from the University of Texas at Arlington with her bachelor's and master's in city and regional planning. She is currently a planner in Southeast Texas as an urban designer in her own urban planning design firm, Do Right by the Streets, DRBTS, which focuses on placemaking as a tool to implement temporary to permanent space activation projects in communities of color. DRBTS also specializes in breaking the complexities of zoning and its impact on communities and businesses of color. Well, welcome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to start off this conversation kind of talking about the big picture, and I wanted to ask our panelists, and I'll start with you, Victoria. What does inclusive and equitable planning look like to you?
Inclusive and equitable planning to me looks like a planning scenario where people who speak other languages outside of English are being included, where materials are being translated for them, and they're being brought in as someone who is equal to other community members, because I feel like the city of Dallas could do better in that regard.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to translating the during the process, translating every step that is happening and how things work is very important. I think, RAYO planning has been doing kind of that work. Jennifer, what is, having an equitable and inclusive planning process look like for you?
So in planning, there's always opportunity for input. That's just kind of part of the system of how planning works. And then there's always a community engagement component to it. So when I think about inclusive planning, it's ensuring that people have the option and are able to provide their input in a manner that's accessible to them. And that making sure that it's not just a few folks with, pushing forward a certain agenda or their input. It's making sure that everyone is heard at the end of the day, because whatever product we're talking about in planning, whether it's a plan or a zoning case, whatever it is, it's going to have a domino effect in everyone's lives. So that's kind of how I see it, is that it should be horizontal, right? Not vertical, top down.
Yeah, and kind of talk about like a little bit about what you mean by like having that input of the community when it comes to planning. I think we think of urban planning as this like big over thing, kind of sometimes unreachable. When it comes to that like ideal method of planning, how do you try to kind of tie those ends from the planning to the neighborhood? Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you an example in my professional capacity. So we were working with a neighborhood where we do know a lot of folks don't have access to internet, or they might not know how to like use a computer. And so when the pandemic happened, we all kind of shifted towards using the digital world to engage. And so what we did in that neighborhood was we wanted to make sure that no matter how busy they were, they had the option to weigh in. So we would send out surveys to every single household in the neighborhood and gave them the option. You could submit it online if you want to, but if you can't, you could drop it off with one of your neighbors. So one of the residents offered to use their front porch as a drop-off location. We had a box we made, and they just dropped their input there so they could walk to their neighbor. Another option we gave them, because we also want to be sensitive to folks not being able to like walk for long distances, was you could call this number and we'll submit it for you on the phone. So that's what I mean about equitable planning, is that you're not just using one method to use input, you're really thinking about the different scenarios and different limitations people have, and making sure that they have the option to weigh in if they want to.
And meeting them where they're at, either that's online, a phone, in person. The pandemic did pose some challenges, but yeah, I hear that. And I guess we'll go here to Dee. Yeah, I wanted to hear from you kind of what this looks like, within your profession, this inclusive and equitable planning.
So similar to what Jennifer mentioned, like from our professional standpoint, we have to basically check a box. We send it out, and it only goes to property owners. So if you're a renter, like you have an apartment, something's happening big next to you, you wouldn't know. Like your landlord's gonna give it to the property owner. For me in DRPTS, it's meeting people where they're at outside of like City Hall. We joke all the time that nobody wants to come to City Hall unless it's to pay a bill or go to municipal court. And both of those are usually unpleasant experiences.
Yeah.
So it's meeting people outside of here, you know what I'm saying? It's not having meetings at 9 a.m. when, that particular community, typically communities of color, they work. They can't make that happen. They can't access Zoom, or they're at a job where they can't be on their phone. And then meetings at 5:30, again, same situation of people are getting off work, people have kids. We're trying to make a mad dash to City Hall and get ready, speaker cards and all that. That accessibility is really limited. So from a professional standpoint, we do the bare minimum. We send out notices, but if I got it in the mail, I probably wouldn't read it. I'd probably throw it away, or you wouldn't be able to understand it. On the flip side, it's making sure that that's legible, really. Not legible as handwritten, but legible as far as, okay, what are they really saying? Most people don't want to deal with the city in any capacity. They've had negative experiences, or they get transferred around. It's accessibility that covers all fronts. So language, accessibility, translation, location, transportation, getting, when you're there, is there a wheelchair ramp? Or even if they're just on crutches, like is there a way to get in without them having to like struggle up the steps? And even when you get to the meeting, not asking the same question of what do you want to see? So many people, particularly communities of color, are tired of hearing that question of what do you want to see, and then you do the city does the exact opposite. So it's, okay, is this a community engagement meeting, or is it just doing it because we have to by state law? So from a professional standpoint, we do it because we have to by state law, but we don't always engage people the way that we should, as far as the real questions of how hard was it for you to get to this meeting? Either having to leave your job early, drop your kids off, bring your kids. So that's, equity is a word that people have used a lot since 2020, but I don't think people have truly understood what that looks like when you are in a household that is black or brown, as far as getting to these public meetings. My parents don't go to meetings. Even being a good public engagement, my parents don't go.
Same, I'm a reporter.
Yeah, you know, we live real lives outside of this, you know what I'm saying? Like, I wasn't going to public meetings, I wasn't going to council, I wasn't going to city hall unless I had a speeding ticket or something. So we still have families of color who still are trying to understand how the process works.
Yeah, how do we make those people feel welcome? I think it's something that like we have to work really hard to try to figure out and adjust throughout the process. You know, Albert, I wanted to hear, because your organization does so much civic engagement as well, like what are the challenges, or how challenging is it for communities of color to get their input taken seriously by, you know, officials or city officials or people, you know, the upper beings when it comes to this planning process?
I would say, for the most part, I think maybe in my experience, we're just limited. There's some people in the city that are receptive to it. I would say some of those aren't necessarily the people that are like elected or appointed that I've seen. Some of them that are a little bit more receptive and I guess have some sort of compassion for communities or maybe the staff people. And I think, so I say that to say like, most of the times we feel like we're struggling against the city or pushing against the city, but there are like some people with good intentions or good hearts or want to listen to the community. But I think the people that have the power to do so, I think specifically in the areas that I focused on, haven't put in the extra effort to. You've mentioned that some of the work that I do with Somos Tejas, especially over the last year and a half, has been trying to increase awareness and engagement with the West Oak Cliff Area Plan. And we've done this in conjunction with other grassroots groups in Oak Cliff. And one of the very first struggles I think that we had was that the commission that was put together, the task force that was put together by the city councilman that represents that area, was as unreflective of the community as can be. And that area,
sorry.
that area, the West Oak Cliff Area Plan covers parts of Dallas that are the most densely Hispanic areas in the city of Dallas. So the city of Dallas is very much, most of the people, I guess 40% are Hispanic or Latinx, right? Okay. But this area is the densest area of the Hispanic population. And if you looked at that task force was like 85% not Latinx or Hispanic. So I think that's kind of one, just from the start. I guess you're starting off from a position where you don't really even have people that can communicate effectively or understand the perspective that some of those people are from. And a lot of those people that were brought in from the perspective of developers or people that had development interests. So I think the challenge to answer your question is that sometimes from the very start, the groups that are responsible for getting community input aren't from the community or don't represent different traits of the community, or don't necessarily have the community's interests in mind, because some of them might be influenced by their own interests. So I think that's just one of the challenges. And I think another challenge is not necessarily dictated by the city, but has been dictated by patterns, and I guess in some ways like trauma. It's just that people in Oak Cliff, where I grew up, they're skeptical and they don't trust. And having to, in the work that I do, try to understand that and try to kind of push them to be involved is a challenge.
And sympathize with
yeah.
their stories.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay,
you definitely
okay,
did.
okay.
And I think I saw one of y'all perk up over here. I don't know if either of you wanted to address, some of the challenges in, getting communities of color to get their input taken seriously during this planning process.
Yeah, so I'll share an experience. I was in a commission meeting where constituents were sharing their concerns, right, about like this process. And commissioners were very dismissive and even rude to these people who were just saying like, hey, I'm scared about this situation because it's my livelihood, right? It's where I live, it's my community. And I was like, dealing with that internal turmoil and looking around, and I saw a photo of one of the people in the room who was advocating for themselves, and they were hung up on a wall. And in my mind, I thought about that scenario, and I thought, these commissioners, these institutions are willing to hang us and use our image on a wall, but not have our voice as part of that. And so like RAYO Planning, Jennifer and I have, and Evelyn Mayo have started RAYO Planning, and we want to pass the mic to people who have been voiceless in the past because of systemic racism, because of the way that structures are set up in our institutions. When you go into a room and it feels so uncomfortable, I've sat on a city commission before, and I'm also a person who's multi-ethnic. Like my father's family is white, and that's a privilege, and I've had exposure to white people because of that experience. And even for me, it was very uncomfortable. I was like one of a handful of women of color, one of a handful of people of color, and then I was definitely the youngest person in the room. But RAYO really wants to help people to feel equipped and prepared in those scenarios, because we understand that it's stressful and it can feel othering, but your voice still matters because your lived experience matters.
Yeah, I really want to hear more about like where organizations like all of y'all's comes in. And Jennifer, RAYO Planning's work is centered, a lot around like advocating for community, what you guys call like self-determination. What do you guys, how do you define self-determination, and then what does the work that you do entail?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I want to give some context when we kind of define self-determination. So part of our mission is promoting a fair and affordable housing that is free of environmental hazards. The reason why we decided to pursue that mission was because we recognize that right now, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are not afforded fair housing that is free of environmental hazards. And so why? Because as what Victoria has started already to kind of tap into is that there's been systems and racist policies and practices that have othered us. And I say us because I identify as Mexican American. And so for us, self-determination looks like making sure that the BIPOC community has the option for self-determination, because for so long we've never had it. And so it's bringing back and ensuring that they do decide what they want for their neighborhood, what is their vision, and making sure that we're also pretty cognizant of just what options they have. And I was at the last session with about the GAF campaign, and I was almost in tears just listening about their struggle and how it's affected not just the current generation, but it goes back and it's affecting people's lives, not just economically speaking, right, but just health-wise and mental wellness, well-being. And it's just these planning decisions are not just a pro forma Excel sheet. Like, this is more than that. This is our personal lives. So that's why we're so passionate about it, because we want to make sure we move away from, as we all hear, zip code is like your fortune teller to what's going to happen, likely happen in your life. We don't want that to be the case no more. And what does that mean? Is that we need to start looking at these policies and practices that are having a negative effect to our communities. So that's why we, as Victoria said, we try to work intentionally to make sure that folks are able to use the mic. And if they never use the mic, well, we're going to help you, help you with drafting your speaking points, making more awareness. Because like Dee said, sometimes we have bad experiences in some spaces, but their voice matters. And so we'll work with you to make sure that we'll figure out a way, whether it's helping you draft a letter or what that might be. And that's also another way you meet people where they are, you meet their comfort level. Because if you look at specifically, like in my community, Mexican and Mexican American community, there is that fear of coming out of the shadow, and depending on your documentation status.
Yeah.
So we're really aware about that too.
Yeah, a lot of, this work is not easy. It's hard, it's emotional, it takes an emotional toll on you. I hear your passion. So during this, process of urban planning, how, Victoria, how do you work to come up with like restorative solutions and that are, sensitive to the trauma that you guys hear, through this process?
Yeah, we try to be very trauma informed whenever we go into the community. We've hosted workshops where we did like land acknowledgements, grounding moments of centering, and acknowledging history, because sometimes we don't even know what has been done. I think that's really important for people also to accept wherever they might be in that healing process. In response to some of the work that we've done, like one woman was like, I'm kind of fearful about this, like that's how I'm feeling. And then another woman was like, I feel fine about this. I know like I can advocate. And that fear is because of historical trauma, vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is something that hasn't happened to you personally, but the history, the pillaging, the physical taking, the redlining, and that hurts. But again, RAYO wants to connect people with their personal story and knowing that their oneness, their uniqueness matters, and that their voice is so important to this process because no one else can speak up for you. You really have to, you're like a little missing puzzle piece that we need for the wholeness of a plan.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that we have organizations like you guys that really, do this work, and I think it's really amazing the way that you do it. It is hard work, but there's also moments of joy through that planning process. And I wanted to come to you, Dee, because you break down, like part of the thing that you do with your organization, you break down complicated subjects like zoning and land use policy through like music and art. How do you do that?
Honestly, I think being thrusted into zoning as like a straight out of graduate school, public sector job, it frustrated me so much that I couldn't get a grasp of it. So it was like you have to associate it to something that you can understand. And the more you listen to it, the more you read it, and the more you listen to hip hop, it may be other genres of music as well. It's literally poems of their struggle, poems of things that, whether it's not always land use, but it's accessibility. Or a lot of times it's about food stamps, Section 8. So these are all like backpedal results of zoning and land use policies, racist policies, and also like a Kickstarter to redlining. So the music it's an easier pool with people. It's not just throwing out and saying, oh, zoning, land use. People they don't connect the dots. As of recently, probably, but like 2 years ago, you were like speaking another language that they didn't understand as far as, okay, I just want to do it, or I feel like I saw this next to me, I don't understand why I can't do it. Going through this process of being in planning You learn a lot that people may be older, but in a sense they are really like children. If I saw so-and-so do it, then I want to be able to do it too. Or I want to be able to, if they're doing it wrong, I want to be able to tell them. So you have to at least get everybody on the same page. And mutually, that's music as well as art. Art is an expression similarly to music in the sense of, like with the MLK food part, the artist that came out and did the letters that were facing MLK, he did, the forest as far as the historical Black element of South Dallas, but also land acknowledgement to the indigenous people that were there first. Same thing like Victoria said, we don't know, but him paying that homage, it's like, okay, the art starts to speak volumes to this is what it was. Before any of us were here, there was no land use, there was no zoning, it was just settlement, It was like a bypass of people that looked like us came here out of fear from other places. So how can we now come in and implement this policy on top of them, which ultimately, we pushed them here for a reason, which is what a lot of those lyrics say, like, not to quote them verbatim, but they put us on the outskirts of the city for a reason. They disconnect us from resources and access for a reason. Once you become, self-reliable, you have this sense of self-determination, it's kind of like, okay, well, how did they do that? We have to find some way to put in policy that they don't truly understand to stop their growth. So the music is a big part of it, especially when it comes down to younger generations of translating what that looks like. They may not ever go to a council meeting, but if you attach a lyric or a song to it and you drive them past it, they can show you why this abandoned building has been like this, but like this other way, this block is like boom, 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 new development. They see it and it starts to connect. So it's like a visual experience.
Yeah, and you've recently been, attending places where there's a lot of young people
Yeah.
and like teaching them kind of the same, right?
Yeah, it's. I always say that when people invite me to like talk to their classes, I'm not trying to like coerce them to be urban planners. It's a labor of love for sure.
Yeah.
But they do it in their own path. It doesn't have to be under the urban planning umbrella. I don't think any of us really consider ourselves planners. We do what we feel is right for the people that we love and the communities that we care about. Whether those are like my community adjacent, not being in stuff that was native, but seeing these people, hearing their stories. You have these kids who have relatives that are fighting some addiction, that are homeless, not because they are terrible people as, the cities and the policies portray them. I would say 50 to 70% of the people in South Dallas that are homeless can tell you a story about a house, the exact location that they lived, and that lot is probably now vacant. It's not like they just, they don't hear it, they have no connection here. They're here, they just don't have any tie back to it because they've been uprooted from what they know. So being able to connect them are always, in addition to not trying to coerce kids, it's like, most kids know their situation. They know if their school has they may not know the number, they know if they have a high dropout rate, or pregnancy rate, or standardized testing, like they know that, they hear, they listen. There's no point for me to go and like regurgitate those stats to them or try to be like a parent and lecture them. It's just like, how can you be involved in a way that looks like this? Especially now with social media taking over like this idea of social entrepreneurship, it's like, okay, if I pull this out of the social media realm and I put it in a building, what can I do around it? And that's where we kind of like open up the conversation of zoning and land use. But it's hardly ever I go into a class and it's like zoning 101 as a PowerPoint. It doesn't go over pretty.
No, that would be.
Yeah, it's not a good look.
Yeah, and you mentioned the MLK Food Park, and this is one of the most recent, I think, projects that you worked on. I wanted to hear a little bit more about like what was the idea of that and how it came together.
Yeah, I can't take all the credit. The first one I was brought in by Better Board, which is a nonprofit placemaking group in West Oak Cliff. They were brought in by the Real Estate Council, which is TREC, with all the funding. So it was slated for 2020, the pandemic happened, but they still have the funds. So the idea was to originally highlight this hard corner that.
And the photos up there, just so this is what we're referring to, the MLK Food Park. Yeah.
So it was initially supposed to be bringing people to this hard corner that this developer had owned for for forever. And was just pretty much waiting for gentrification to take its toll, so he just sitting on it, no development or anything. But he was willing to lease it out, the least likely place that people would come. So it was to transform this corner as a safe space, a space that people can gather. It's like a park space, community garden, even like with the shelters, or not the shelters, but like the stands, so they're not your typical like pop-up tents. And to address mobile food vending policy in the city of Dallas, like how systemic and racist that is, in the sense of you have people that are city staff telling people if you don't have 25,000, don't think about it. Like,
That is just something that will be discussed next Wednesday.
Right,
the
it is.
Food ordinance.
so if you're here, or I'll be there virtually. So it was to really tackle that idea of these policies are only fit for one group and one group only, as well as this idea of activating space. So we did that for about 30 days, and the idea was to focus on businesses that were based in South Dallas, or at least had a home in South Dallas. Of course, they weren't all, but a good portion of them were. And it was, I think it was more than any of us could have anticipated as far as the build process, dealing with the city and then the neighbors. I will, admittedly say that the initial outreach from like Trek wasn't a lot. It was really just relying on the main churches in that area, which is St. Philip's and Cornerstone. A lot of people didn't know that the park was coming. They just felt like it was another one of those things that the city was going to drop down, that they weren't going to have access to, so they really paid no mind to it. So that was, again, with Victoria and Jennifer mentioned, even Albert, many people where they are. South Dallas is a community that is very much word of mouth. They still want to be able to talk to you and see you and hand flyers, putting flyers in the window. And I'm grateful that a lot of businesses were cool with that, and cool with me being present to do that, not being a South Dallas native, and not being, from there. And also being very intentional that I was the only Black person truly in that front facing, not being like, the token, as far as, okay, we're just gonna go to these main spots that people know, and just, reciting the script based off what the other organizations, which are white, are saying. And I think a lot of that helped draw people to the park, whether they were spending money or just utilizing the space. So just being able to cultivate this space, there's always this history in South Dallas that we didn't do. It was already there. It just needed space to do it. So a big part of that was bringing people out. Not pre-pandemic, but in a sense that people felt comfortable to see their neighbors, to hug them, to talk to them, to communicate with them. It's always, I guess it's cool when thousands of people come out or whatever, but it's more so the people who are there, that live there, the people that lived on the hill in these apartments that have notoriously had issues with the city, that walk down and would spend, buy something for 10, 15 kids. The things that everybody said that no one would do. Nobody would come to South Dallas, nobody would even want to come down there, especially on that corner, but you can go down to Gillies, like right down the street, on the south side of Lamar. It was the idea, people sharing their personal lived experiences. Someone stopped one day where we were setting up. She just rolled her window down. She's like, I have property a block away. Are they gonna take that when this is over? There's no connection whatsoever, but it's like people see movement and they haven't seen anything, and they get worried, they get fearful. They haven't seen any movement in South Dallas in eons. No real movement, like maybe patchwork, but nothing like seriously transformative in a way that it's like, okay, we're not just trying to benefit off of your trauma, pivot off of your trauma. It's things like that people came just to ask those questions of. We may not have the answer, but at least it's to say it's not an attempt to take your property. It's not an attempt to displace you. This space is for you, designed by you to an extent, and just meant for you to exist without. And coming off of a summer to where racial tension was so high, especially in a city that has this downs itself is very progressive and definitely has a track record that shows otherwise. It was really important to show that there's places that you can exist as a person of color, as a Black person, whether homeless, whether 6-figure job, 4-figure job, whatever. You can exist in this place and you wouldn't know from the next person. Like, you don't know if you're standing next to a millionaire or standing next to somebody who is battling a heroin addiction. You don't know. You're just sharing space with these people. And that was a big a big token of it for me. You know what I'm saying? In the sense of everything you know about South Dallas is the park. Fair Park, it stops there, the State Fair, and that's pretty much it. Most people don't have the funds to go to the fair like that, you know, especially if the fair is more expensive. But they close down like a good chunk of South Dallas for these outsiders to come in from all over the place. To park, people to the point now to where they just, to avoid the eminent domain, they just let people park on their yard. You know, that's money for them today in that time frame, but it's like people's daily lives get interrupted, and it goes back to what Victoria and Jennifer were saying. These planning processes aren't just like temporary. They are, they're long-term issues. There's long-term problems with what the city feels like is most beneficial for this particular community. So having this space and being able to constantly pull back into it and draw into the people that it caters to the most has been eye-opening as far as what that looks like.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
There's an update with that, right?
Oh yeah, so phase 4 is happening on May 15th. So I'm taking it, I've been given the grace to take it over under DRBTS and just run it as best as we can. We obviously don't run it as long.
What does phase 4 look like?
Um,
What is that?
So we're in the same location, so across the street from the MLK Center. And I'm always very intentional about, we're not trying to create a community center like it's already, MLK Center is already doing a phenomenal job with the resources that they have. Don't reinvent the wheel. But it's now creating a space of like business incubation. The Dallas Black Chamber of Commerce offices in South Dallas. I'm a big believer, if you have these resources, why not conglomerate them so people can figure it out? So phase 4 is now geared towards, okay, we're moving towards permanency. That was a big reason why I started PRBTS, was place creation that is permanent, that you don't feel like I'm gonna use you for 40, 30 days or 14 days, and then I'm gonna leave you and you gotta clean it up, which is basically what the fair is. The fair is like a revolving attraction. And then when it's gone, communities have to pick up the pieces of the money's gone, the people are gone, the desire to be in South Dallas is gone. So phase 4 is really moving forward to more funding, more partners, bringing up more the neighborhood associations in South Dallas to feel seen and welcome for the ones that are not on the internet at all. And of course, the business aspect, getting people to a place of comfort as far as dealing with the city or moving into a space. So giving a little bit of everything as you get closer to it. So thank you. I totally forgot about it. I forget about it. Yeah.
Albert, I wanted to come to you because I think I love a lot of work that Somos Tejas does, because it deals with something as like going door to door, registering people to vote, people to fill out the census. How does something like just, registering to vote or filling out the census feed into the bigger picture that is, the planning process or urban planning?
Yeah, so our group, we're a civic engagement group, and we do voter engagement, voter registration. But I think civic engagement is not just that. That's part of civic engagement. I think that's an important part of civic engagement. I think other people have mentioned, especially in the communities that we work in, Somos Tejas focuses on the Latinx community, specifically in Dallas for now. And a lot of that community, some of them aren't eligible to vote for a variety of reasons. But there's other ways people can get engaged and involved. If you look at different models or different ways that people get involved and have a way to determine their future, make decisions about their future, like some of those are like labor unions. Like labor unions are groups and people vote and make decisions and they have a say, and people sometimes feel empowered by things like that. A model similar to that we can use in the community is like neighborhood associations. So they're not HOAs, they're like neighborhood associations, just groups where neighborhoods get together. They have some sort of communal relationship with each other, so they get to know each other, who they are, what they do, their kids' names, and what schools their kids go to. But they also stay informed, and they make decisions of this is what we're going to do, this is the activity we're going to do, this is the stance we're going to take, or the approach that we're going to take on this certain subject. I think that is one way of civic engagement that I have been focusing on. And I think a lot of that work is still in its, and we've been doing it for the last maybe a year and a half. So we've been helping neighborhood associations try to get the Latinx population, that's the majority of that area, out. Because even in areas that are 80% Latinx, you don't see 80% show up to the neighborhood association meetings for sure. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is doing exactly what you said, is doing outreach door to door, at minimum leaving flyers so people are aware that there's a meeting or there's an event. And it's not just once, right? I can't tell you how many houses I've been to several times. And unfortunately, because we have that approach, the area that we can focus on is pretty compact. But I've been to houses several times, and that's kind of the reason why we started. We wanted to do kind of like year-round campaigning, right? Like if you think of a traditional campaign, you think of someone that wants to get votes, and they come around for the 3 months before election day, and they'll show up after the vote, and you'll never see them again. And we think and we believe that having and establishing trust is by like being there consistently and showing up and having them know you, or at least recognize you. So that's kind of one of the things that we're doing to try to make sure that we enable people to get on those lanes that allow them to make decisions that aren't necessarily just voting. All right, so like the West Oak Cliff area plan is one of those things. You have a say. So one, do you even know about it? And that's the hurdle that we've had is one, is getting people to know about it.
Do they know about it? Do most people know about stuff?
I would say most people know there's something happening, right? I think most
it's like word of mouth kind of thing.
Well, most people just expect something to happen, at minimum. And then some people, especially in Oak Cliff, they see other parts of Oak Cliff have changed. So they kind of see it coming or feel it coming. And once they do get some exposure, I would say most of the people probably still don't know what the West Oak Cliff area plan is, but they probably know like something's going on, right? I feel like people have like that instinctual gut feeling. Yeah, I mean, we've reached thousands of homes just in the West Oak Cliff area plan, but we still haven't reached all of them. And the homes that we've reached, a lot of them we've reached multiple times, but some of them we still haven't reached multiple times, right? So like, I know because of meetings that we've been to, that we've hosted, where we've invited the city out, that there's a significant population that feels also kind of like bombarded by this.
What do you mean?
So I think everyone knows, they have a feeling that change is going to happen, or it's coming, or it's being planned. But whenever you have someone come to your door and say, hey, the public comment period ends in 60 days, show up to this meeting so you can at least know what this plan is about. Even though this plan's been happening for a year and a half, people feel like shoot, like they feel, it's like imminent and it's gonna happen, and they don't, and there's a lot of fear associated with it. But to go back to your question, is we have voter engagement, voter registration. That's one part. Another part, and there's several avenues, but the avenue that we've been focusing on right now is just neighborhood engagement, giving people the opportunity to, one, be aware of things that are happening, and that's a long-term thing, right? The West Oak Cliff area plan is one thing, but as part of this process, we're collecting information, numbers, emails, getting to know the people that live there. So when authorized hearings for zoning changes come around, we reach out to those people that we've built some relationships with. We are working with not just residents. We've been working, at least most recently, very closely with some of the business operators that are going to be mostly impacted or heavily impacted by some of the changes that are being recommended. So just giving people opportunity to, at minimum, be aware, like Jennifer said, have the option to show up and give your opinion, making sure that they're aware of the avenues to provide that opinion, giving them other avenues to give that opinion. So by creating some of those avenues to give them opinion through petitions or additional surveys, and helping neighborhood associations that exist increase engagement of the Latinx community, and people show up and get plugged in, and maintaining that engagement. In some areas that they don't exist, identifying and finding and connecting with people to say, okay, you might be a great person to start this neighborhood association. Have you ever thought of it? Because unfortunately, although neighborhood associations can be a great tool, I think we're not at the point now where in my community they are a great tool, because they're still, how can you say, not necessarily representative. And that's just some of the work that we're trying to do. So a lot of the work that I see that I do myself, I think of it as doing the work of democracy, because it's like, one, letting people know, giving them the opportunity to engage in other ways that aren't just voting, and say, hey, like, petitions are democratic, like, tools. So having people fill out petitions or sign petitions, and yeah, that's kind of the larger, more comprehensive view of civic engagement that we're hoping to take. And right now, it's really voter engagement, neighborhood engagement, and there's other avenues that perhaps we might not be aware of yet, and we would want to include and incorporate those kind of things. But
yeah, a lot of the work that you do is centered around listening, and I think that's like very huge and powerful. And I was wondering if, like, you know, you're talking about the West Oak Cliff area plan, like, during one of those meetings, has there been like either a meeting or a moment that just like really resonated with you as it deals with like listening and thinking of the future of that neighborhood?
I think I referred to it earlier a bit when I said people feel bombarded and they feel panicked, and because of that, they're angry or they're really afraid. And in meetings that we've hosted with neighborhood associations, and we've invited the community out, and the community has come out in numbers to some of those. I definitely remember the feeling of how upset they were, and how fearful they were. And that to me told me that although we've put in a lot of effort, there was still a lot more to be done. And it's just kind of just reminding me that, like, we need to work harder, do more, bring more people in, and just continue to push it regularly. But it was just feeling and understanding that people are really afraid and some people are really angry.
Yeah, and like, you know, and anyone can jump in, but like, how do you turn, I guess, that fear and that being afraid into, you know, we talked about this aspect of self-determination and being able to speak for yourself and being part of, you know, going back to the planning process and being involved in that.
I feel like emotion. I feel like emotion is a great driving force for galvanizing people in this work, but unfortunately, you know, emotions fade, and so I feel like love. Ultimately, I feel like that's why I try to center myself in, you know, because it's like for the love of your community, for the love of Oak Cliff, or West Oak Cliff, or West Dallas. You know, it's because you love the people. So I think bringing it back to the reason why we do our work and it being community-centered is so important. But those moments of tough realization, you know, of feeling maybe taken advantage of or not informed, not giving access to people, and having those really strong responses are a part of the process, and I think a part of the awakening of a lot of people who needed the experience in order to be galvanized for the movement.
And I'll answer your question too, sorry. Part of the reason why we started Somos Tejas is, like I mentioned earlier, to like continually engage people. I don't know what I can do to like make people not fearful or not angry in that moment, but you know, I'm confident that over time, if people continuously get presented the ability to give their opinion, or people continually get become more aware of things that are happening in their neighborhood or community, then they're going to be less angry or less afraid, right? So I think it's just like what no city does is like they don't continuously, intentionally, regularly try to get the opinions of the people whose lives they're affecting. And they don't try to do the outreach. They don't even do, like, they honestly don't even do the minimum most of the time. But just like regular communication will build the trust that will help alleviate some of that anger and some of that that fear.
And to add on to what Victoria said as far as like emotion, a lot of these communities, especially speaking of South Dallas, there was a time where they had, they built all this stuff out of the city not wanting them to have access. When 35 came through, just for the petition to have that service road access, they've been dehumanized in the sense to where like these policies have literally stripped them of economic resources, affordable housing, fair housing, or even just the thought that they can start over here. So they went elsewhere. They went to Cedar Hill, DeSoto, North Dallas. With those, it's kind of like you have a chip on your shoulder. You go to those places trying to prove that you're good enough. You know what I'm saying? And you're almost having to, I don't want to say enabling, but you're caught them. You're having to like pretty much reteach them how to be self-sustaining because the city's policies and developers, like Albert mentioned, even in South Dallas, they're knocking on people's doors saying that, we're going to buy your property in 60 days or eminent domain, and 70, 80-year-old people, they don't, not even 70, 80, 50, 60, they don't know. I paid my taxes. There's something tax related, and not something of tenants. There's nobody that's really going to do that. They don't really have the power to do that. And that's tough, you know what I'm saying? That's tough. Even like listening to people or kids, like when I went working with City Lab, that they have grandparents who they had to sit on the phone or answer phone calls or letters from somebody trying to buy their grandparents or their parents' home. And their person impressing on them like it's gonna be tomorrow type of thing. Like, and their grandparents or their parents, they're worried. So for us in this realm, it's the emotion is sometimes it's heartbreaking, but it's also like these people go to jobs every day. They have families to take care of. They believe that the city has their better, their quality of life at the pinnacle. And like I would mention again, select people do, but it's unfortunately not the people that make the decision and hold the power really make change. So if they're doing that, how can they advocate for themselves too? You're having to empower them, teaching them how to advocate for themselves. In a Black community, I'm not saying it's challenging, but it's also, a lot of these people have lived through segregation. They've lived through being bombed. They've lived through those times of, being police for being Black, heavier than what possibly that we see today. Like, even being able to like sit in the same stage with other people that don't look like me. They've been in it, so they know what it's like to organize, but they see the city and reform, and the city's gotten almost, I guess, big-headed. Like, they've grown, all these cool things are coming. For all the cool things that the city has, their community's hanging on by a thread, just trying to get the roads fixed, So it's empowering people of who to send a letter to, what petition to sign. Don't sign everything, but sometimes you have to just sit back and let people be a shoulder to lean on, because like he mentioned, there's nothing I can do to make people not be fearful of what's coming from, the other side of Baltimore Gene. There's nothing I can do to make people feel like if I miss one tax payment, they're coming to get my house today. And a lot of them, for them to have been property owners so long, they don't understand their rights. They don't know anymore. So much is happening in the city that they truthfully can't keep up. So it's having to rebuild this community that they were they were go-getters, they were fighters. The city, like, they burned them out. They drug them to the ground. So it's now building up that, maybe not them, but their kids, their grandkids. It's all of like, what if, well, like we all can probably attest to, communities of color can't wait any longer for cities to like get it. It's kind of like now and then.
We can't forever for cities to get it together.
Facts.
I have one more thing to add. So
Yes,
she
go ahead.
reminded me of something that directly answers your question, because you had asked me, is there something that you remember? And I was mentioning earlier, people have a gut feeling. People know, even though like no one's come to their door and said, hey, There's a zoning recommendations they're having. They know because developers do call them. They just don't show up to their door. Like they call them and like they're asking because the developers, they know, right? Like they have the information. They say, oh, like this area plan's gonna push recommendations, those recommendations will lead to zoning changes. They say if I get this house before the zoning changes, then, or this property before zoning changes, once it does, like the value of it just increases just because the rules change, right? But most of the people don't know that because they're living their lives and they're doing whatever they need to do. And yeah, one thing I remember is someone at one of the meetings that we hosted with the neighborhood association that came out, and she was like, yeah, I had to change my number because like they were just harassing me because they were just calling her all the time trying to buy the property. So even if they don't know that the zoning changes or things are coming down the pipeline, like they know because like people are reaching out to them because they want to buy their property.
Yeah, and these developers get your phone number, they text you, they send you email, they get all this information.
Yeah, they sit in the back of your community meetings with malintention. They have no intention of like doing what is for the better. Like he said, like they're essentially harassing people. Nobody knows the area plan better than city staff, especially not a developer. He shouldn't at least. You know what I mean? Like for him to say that, it's always, well, either you give it to me now or the city's gonna take it. Like, and that's for somebody on the phone. It's like, okay, well, man, should I be thinking about moving? Do I need to get an attorney? Do I need to get a lawyer? Do I need to get a... They have no idea. They're on the phone and somebody literally telling them, hey, I can see your house and I may be purchasing it in the next 6 months. Like, they're terrified.
What that is affinity fraud, you know, because of they're
Exactly.
saying like I'm showing up, I'm part of the city or I'm part of like this institution, and I've had friends experience that as well. Like this guy showed up to my friend's grandparents' house on Chalk Hill Road, and it was like I'm with the city, signed these papers, and they were Spanish speaking. And so there was an elderly couple, and Jesse's mom just happened to show up in the middle of this happening. She's like, you know what, get that, off my property. But that's a huge privilege because she just happened to show up at the right time and happened to be like Spanish and English speaking to ask the right questions that her parents couldn't.
For sure. And it's not a every now and again thing. Like they're everywhere. They're almost like hounding people, waiting to see who's the loudest voice. Where do they congregate? Where do they, it's not hard to impersonate city staff. Like everybody doesn't have a city shirt, everybody doesn't, go out in a city vehicle. So even for organizations like ours, you have to work 10 times harder to gain people's trust because, okay, the last person that said they were with the city, they did everything like the opposite of what they said, and I had to sign all these things. No city staff is ever gonna ask for your personal information or, where you work, what you do, anything like that, but they fall a victim to that before, and it's like, how do they know? How can they trust you? It's a business card isn't enough. There's nothing that's gonna persuade them enough, especially if it's an elderly couple or an elderly homeowner. Like, some of the developers are, there's no humanism in it. It's pro forma. It's the dollar. It's land that they need and that they want, and one way or another, they're gonna find a way to get it or try to get it.
I think this relates to the question that I had where, we talk about what the landscape looks like right now and the challenges that come with that and when you guys come in. So, hearing from all of you and hearing about this great, this work that you guys do is very inspiring. And I think about, like we talked about the future generations and, thinking about these future generations, maybe people who are here, or people who want to get into this kind of work. What is, we've talked about how this is hard work, but what piece of advice do you guys offer for people who want to be like you and be part of this changing the narrative, this new generation of like urban planners, trying to get, communities of color in the room?
Something I always think about, this is a high school teacher told me this at one point too, but just always ask questions. And I personally think question your surroundings constantly. That's something I never questioned growing up in West Oak Cliff. I just thought everything was normal. And that's because I was learning about this country alongside with my parents. And so I didn't know about what a city plan commission is. I never knew what zoning was. It's like, I feel like a puppet, right? Like there's like some hands above kind of moving things around. And I'm just over here, like, have you ever watched the Truman Show or something like that? Like that is literally how I felt growing up without understanding what urban planning was. I think, myself, Victoria, and a lot of us, it's like, what is urban planning? But then when you open that book and you realize, oh my God, like that was a tool, one of many tools, not the only one, that was used to other people and to build a lot of what we see today, the landscape today. So we know urban planning has a lot of potential, we've seen it. So it's just making sure we reverse the intentionality to the good of all, the good of, specifically the BIPOC community that carry the burden. And, something too about just speaking about the planning field, right? Planners have the ethical responsibility to promote equity. So the idea of like how you would even get there, without a question, the professionals, that's your ethical responsibility to push for equity. But it's knowing that planners don't have all the solutions. And it's understanding that that's why we need the community at large, everyone involved, because something I even say, even though I went to planning school, that degree doesn't tell me people's lived experience. That degree, yeah, it teaches me how to look up data and I can get the lay of the land, but that is very still surface level. It's not telling me what the real issue is. It's like the iceberg. That's people's lived experience that we need to understand people's lived experience and know them. And I think that's what this work is not just the professionals. For RAYO planning, we believe everyone is a planner because you have your lived experience whether you realize it or not, you've been impacting your surroundings and you've been impacted by them. So we want to make sure that, you have the option to influence your surroundings and your lived experience carries weight. It's not just the developers that have the expertise. That's a huge challenge in planning, that planning doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's politics in the background, right? So it's something that you always have to be sensitive of how that's happening and how that's influencing your ability to provide input to some degree at times. And that's something, I personally hear when talking to community members that, they'll call me and express how frustrated they are. And going back to, we can't help people get rid of that frustration. It's just part of being a human being. You're responding to a crisis, to a concern you have. And one thing I've just done is I just listen. That's all I do. And sometimes that's all people need. They want someone to vent to, and they say, I'm tired. I've been doing this since like the 40s. Like I'm exhausted. And all you can do is just be another person helping to support them and listen to them. It's just being a friend, human being.
Yeah. I think Jennifer's point of asking questions is really important. As like a multi-ethnic kid, my mom's family was from West Dallas in Oak Cliff, and then my dad's family was from Richardson, and I saw a really great difference in their experiences growing up. I didn't really understand why they had better paved roads or water runoff infrastructure, drainage, why their libraries were better than ours. And so for me as a child, that was really tough, understanding that. But I think that for your question, history is a huge part of what I would want people to learn about through this process. I feel like history isn't really about the past, it's truly about the future, because if you can manipulate or control what someone knows about their past, you can control what they believe is possible in the future. And so being affirmed by your own personal history is huge, because that's a story that a teacher can't teach you in the classroom. It's something that's personal, that you have to receive from your ancestors, from your family members, and while they're still living.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And, I didn't get to this, but there was a project that RAYO Planning worked on that deals with this historical aspect. But this was an altar or an ofrenda, but it honored places in Oak Cliff that no longer exist. What was, the importance of honoring and celebrating places, in that history of the places in Oak Cliff that are no longer with us, that aren't there anymore.
So it was an ofrenda or altar that typically ofrendas are honoring people that have passed on for Day of the Dead or Dia de los Muertos. We celebrated on November 1st and 2nd. But just because of my own personal experience of loss with physical place and stake, I decided to highlight places that had been gentrified out of Oak Cliff. So one of the buildings was El Corazón de Tejas, which was a Tex-Mex restaurant that was originally El Chicos and then became Tejanos, which I knew it as growing up in Oak Cliff. My dad would pick me up for our bi-weekly visits, and we would eat there. So it was really special to me. And I loved the building itself. Like, it had a beautiful birthday cake facade and murals inside and chandeliers, and I can still hear the mariachis inside. But it was just a scenario where there's no protection done. And the owners decided to sell. And so I hung a banner on the building trying to protect it last second. I was thinking maybe this will help someone who has the money to buy the building so it could be preserved. Maybe this will be that, but it wasn't. It was torn down the same day. And it was just a really terrible loss because, this land is indigenous land, but this land is also land that used to be Mexico. And so you would think that there would be many more historical markers for the Mexican experience, and there aren't. And El Corazón de Tejas was a loss in that it should have been historically designated and landmarked for our history.
Yeah, I think we have on the slide, there's a photo. I'll try to point to it when we get there. But I really wanted to hear from you, Dee and Albert, about what kind of piece of advice or wisdom would you offer to people wanting to get into this work or future urban planners?
I can go first, Steve.
Go ahead.
I think the only advice that I could give is advice that I need to take myself. And that's to go back and focus on I'm taking a step back before I take a step forward. So you mentioned love. I think love kind of grounds a lot of the work that we do. Love for the people, love for the community. But when you think about that, you have to think about, what does love mean, or how do you show it? One, you have to show care for the things that you say you love, so care for the people. But another facet that you kind of have to show is commitment. You say you love someone or something, you have to have a certain level of commitment to that thing. And for me, that leads me to the advice. It's just what is your commitment, right? I feel like I've been doing this work forever, but I haven't really. Because maybe I've done, little things here and there, and here and there, and here and there. And my biggest push for myself is just to continue to show more commitment by continuing to make sure that I put in effort or show that I care or take action on a regular basis as much as I can. And for myself, I feel like that's, if we're saying we want to build trust, we have to be more committed, disciplined, and that's the only advice I can give you. If you are committed and disciplined, good things will happen. That's an area, like I said, I need to take my own advice. I've done a lot of work, but I know that there's been times where I've slipped and I haven't been as dedicated, or I haven't been as focused, and I haven't been as taken as much action as I've needed to. So that's really the only advice. So if you say you love something, not only does that mean it's not just something you say, it's just something you have to continuously show, and commitment and dedication is a big part of that.
I should have went before you. But to go off of that for sure, especially as being a South Dallas adjacent, like not growing up in South Dallas at all, and not having, like my ties are from Northern Louisiana, so I have, you know, no real ties to it besides the adjacency of this project. It's kind of like, it's crazy how people just gravitate to you when you don't even anticipate it. But for something that you say you love and you want to change, I say it all the time, but you dive behind it. You go as hard as you can. Obviously taking time for yourself, but understanding that, you know, passion. I always tell people, when people ask me for advice, passion will take you wherever you want to go. That's what gravitates people to you, gravitates us to one another. It makes people want to work with you. It makes people want to be in the same space with you, share space with you, or take a back seat to you because they see like, oh yeah, that there's no amount of schooling, there's no amount of certificates that can like top that passion. It's embedded in you, and I think that's the passion of want better. We talk a lot about it, but it's being solution-based with the people we love, you know what I'm saying, rather than just saying we're innovators or like creative problem solvers. It's getting in the trenches with people that probably don't shoot your head off first, but as you get to know them, as they get to know you, now you're this type of family. being authentic and being passionate, it's gonna go a long way.
And, you know, now I wanted to kind of just thank everyone for being here and the work that you do. Victoria, Jennifer, Albert, Andy, thank you so much. This concludes this panel. I appreciate all of you for coming here today and listening to these amazing leaders here in Dallas. Let's congratulate them and the work that they do.